We've got 3 deck building tips to help you level up your game and improve your decks.
I'm Mia, and I drink coffee at 8 p.m.
I'm BZ. It's 2:30 in the morning right now, and we're the Nitpicking Nerds, sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you've got a late night where you have to stay up and scroll through the internet, you might as well reward yourself with some awesome Magic cards, sealed product, whatever you need. Card Kingdom's got it, so I would recommend going there.
We have a new landing page there where you can see all of our favorite things, so go check it out. Tell them we sent you. It really helps out the channel. We're also sponsored by Dragon Shield, best sleeves in the multiverse.
Good sleeves.
If you use the code
NERDS.
That's nerds at checkout. You can save 5% of your real money textiles on your entire order of everything on Dragon Shield.
And there's a Moxfield ad, but it's not right now. You have to guess where it is. And
Liar.
if you fail to guess, you lied. And if you guessed it right, you cheated. So there's really no winning for you, but it's a fun game. Trust me, it's a fun game to play. Also, if you want to support us directly, our Patreon is a great way to go. It'll help Amber get something to rub up on that isn't my microphone stand. So if you want to do that, deck audits, exclusive gameplay, some musical guests on there, honestly.
If you want to know how we got on Dance Gavin Dance music video, that's our most recent podcast episode.
Absolutely. So those are the sponsors. Now this is the video. We figured we'd go for some deck building tips. We talk about like some gameplay stuff in recent videos that can help you get better. Feel free to check out those after. But we want to do some stuff that is in deck building where you could like win more games, gain percentage points through the deck building process.
This is before you even meet your opponents and see what they're rocking. This is just to help your deck be more consistent. The first one is to have a heavy focus on a theme. Every deck focuses on a theme, but the more you delve into it, the more consistent your deck will be overall because there's more pieces trying to do the thing.
This is not me saying if you want to play Is It Spellslinger, you should build your deck around spells. It's more like whatever your theme is, you need to zero in on it and just go extremely hard on it. So like our rule of thumb, if you're playing the X deck, X is a creature type or a type of card or a thematic thing. If you're playing X deck, you play 35 plus of X. That's our goal. That's been my goal lately with creature type decks, like an elf deck, 35 plus elves, a vampire deck, 35 plus, thank you, Amber, vampires. What are you doing? And if you're playing like a spells deck, 35 plus spells. Lands, maybe 40 plus, you know what I mean? But you want 35, a huge critical mass. Some people try to get away with like 25. That's just not going to work for this.
There are so many times when I've seen somebody play a deck and they have all the payoffs. You know, it's like the gutter snipes and the enchantment that does the same thing as gutter snipe, and they're just not drawing enough of the thing that triggers it because their deck didn't have enough of them. And so even though they have all these payoffs and on paper it looks great, they don't have enough payoff to actually get the engine started.
Yeah, now that we've been doing Patreon deck audits for a pretty long time, pretty substantial amount between live streams, we've audited hundreds of decks like recently. So I've seen this happen all the time where I look at it, I'm like, you got it all right where you have all these payoffs for casting instant or sorceries, or you have all these payoffs for zombies in play, but then you don't have enough ways to make zombies. You need 35 zombies, or probably even more, in the deck, and I think 35 is a nice baseline. I think people get too sidetracked with like alternate strategies and like payoffs that aren't necessarily also the thing. You know, like if there's an instant or sorcery that deals damage equal to the number of instant sorceries, like a volcanic torrent or something, that's totally on theme. That's a payoff and it's the type you want, so it totally counts for that. But like a gutter snipe, it's a nice payoff. It just isn't an instant or sorcery, and you can't clog your deck with those.
It's really true. The exceptions of these are Super Friends decks and decks where you want gigantic creatures. For instance, with Super Friends, you can't have 30 plus planeswalkers in your deck. That starts to clog it up and you won't be able to really get anywhere. And with gigantic creatures, I mean like in Kalia, for instance, you can't have 35 6 plus cost demons. Trust me from experience, you can't do that.
Yeah, so for those two like sort of exceptions to this rule, I would say maybe you're leaning more towards like the 15 zone. I think decks with more than 15 planeswalkers, they're just gonna have trouble functioning. Planeswalkers don't do enough, and gigantic creatures aren't usable enough on average, at least, where you can do something with them on turns 1 or 2. So with gigantic creatures, if you have 3 of them in your opening hand, you basically just have to mulligan, so you can't play that many. And with planeswalkers, they don't do that much and they can be attacked very easily, so you have to like just kind of play less. And if you're wondering how to get to 35, because I've definitely seen decks where people ask us to upgrade it or they show it to us and like, what can I do? And I go, that's tricky. The thing that you need to do is you need to reevaluate your ramp, removal, and card draw, because a lot of times players have that, and if it's like a zombie deck, for example, I guess that's a good example to use. A zombie deck, they're going to have like signets and stuff for ramp, and then they're going to have like, you know, Soul Shatter for removal, and then they're going to have Night's Whisper for card draw, but none of that is zombies. You can tweak those numbers and make it so that, oh, now I'm playing an Undead Augur instead of a Night's Whisper, and now I'm playing a Fleshbag Marauder instead of a Soul Shatter, and now I'm playing some creature that sacrifices for mana, whatever, instead of ramp. You get the idea. Making these little tweaks might make the average card slightly worse, but it makes your deck hum 10 times better.
You want to be able to do the thing as early as possible and then gain footing so you can keep doing it faster than everyone else's deck can get with their theme. I have an example. My Edgar deck, I ran like 30-ish vampires in it at one point. I had like a lot of the staples that came with the precon, and then so just some good payoffs, like the Door of Destinies, the Coat of Arms, etc. And those are great for vampires, but I wasn't like going fast enough with vampires to where it really mattered. I had more high cost vampires in there, and then there wasn't enough time to build up a vampire base to where those cards would be better in play. I actually upped my count to like 40 or 41, and the deck runs so much more smoothly now.
Yeah, you can take out some of the payoffs and now just ensure that every single game you're going to have 6 vampires in play. And I've seen this because I played against the deck when it was before it was upgraded, and it had like, 28 vampires or something, a lot of which were expensive, and I've played with it after. And there was just a game where I wiped your board because I knew that you had Malakir Blood Witch, and then next turn you just played 3 vampires and you were back up to 6. And then I knew the next turn when you played the Blood Witch, it would have been 8 or 10 with another cheap thing. And I'm like, there's no stopping this. And it's just like that tiny difference of just cutting a few of the enablers or switching a few of the removals for vampires that are also removable that might be slightly worse makes it so that now your deck does the main thing it's supposed to do, which is make vampires so that it's never going to sputter out and have those weird games where you just die.
Another example of this is that, like, with card draw, there's Champion of Dusk in here, for instance, which is drawing cards equal to the number of vampires you have on a vampire body. I found that this is better than just cramming in a bunch of just little draw spells where it's like a burst of card draw. I have a couple of those, of course, but doing more thematic card draw and that sort of thing really helps the deck hum.
Yeah, I had this Jalira deck that I've been working on. Mia originally had a Jalira deck, and then I'm sort of like taking it over because I kind of wanted to build it. And it was just playtesting really weird, and the deck wants to sacrifice little creatures to power out gigantic creatures. And I was like, drawing the opening hands, I was like, this kind of sucks. Like, there's nothing really happening for me. I don't feel like I'm ahead, and I can't really feel like, on turn 6 I have a great board. And it's because the deck had too many big creatures, which were the payoffs, and not enough fodder and little things, which are the enablers. So I think I might have to go to like 30, 35 of the little dudes so that I always have a big creature to spin into. And I don't, with that deck specifically, you don't need 1,000 big creatures. In fact, the less big creatures you play, the more guarantee you have to hit a banger.
Maybe it's just a note of like, hey, you should playtest your decks and goldfish them a lot to see what you're lacking, but also if you're lacking something and you can't really figure it out, probably committing to your theme is the best way to start.
Yeah, and you're going to have to, if you have a confused deck or the deck's got 120 cards or you have 100 cards and you don't know what to do, you need to pick one theme, and you really need to gut every other theme. I think there's plenty of like room to wiggle around in there, but I would say if you're trying to like get a hang of what your deck really wants before you buy it or as you playtest it to figure out what you need, cut all of the little nonsense sub-themes. Maybe have one sub-theme, but one main theme of the 35 plus. I think that's going to help you.
You could have a couple sub-themes, but just know that your deck will be weaker than a more finely tuned focus deck.
That also comes with a lot of playtesting too, is you can sort of squeeze 3 and 4 card packages that work well together with your main theme and work by themselves as like a little mini combo once you have a lot of reps in with the deck. Our number 2 tip also comes in the deck building phase, and this is the correct mana base split. Players often, I think, neglect this, and they kind of think of the mana base as not an afterthought, but like a 5-minute process, and you just put in the mana base and you're done. Or I've seen a lot, and I have been guilty of this too, is I'll just build the mana base first and then I build the deck, but that's not really the best way to go about it. What players do is instead of balancing for the spells in their deck, they'll just add the lands symmetrically so that everything's pretty and nice and even, and they go, yeah, this deck is perfectly even. The mana base must be perfect.
I love 3, 4, and 5 color decks, but you need to know what you're going to be playing first to figure out what type of spread you want in your colors. For instance, when it comes to ramping, if you have a lot of 2 mana ramp and a lot of it needs a green pip, a lot of your lands should tap for green and they should come in like untapped as soon as possible so you can actually ramp as fast as possible.
Another example is just because you're a Mardu deck doesn't mean you want 3 of every dual land. Doesn't mean you need Dragon Skull Summit, Clifftop Routine, and Isolated Chapel. You might be very heavy black-red with a slight splash of white. And then it's like, for a lot of those dual land cycles of 3, you can trim off the black-white one or the red-white one if you're mostly going to be red-black. You don't need all 3 of them, especially if you look at the pips of your spells and you don't have any double white pips in your whole deck.
I think another point of this is also when you are kind of like tinkering with a deck and that sort of thing, make sure to also fix the mana base when you do that, because I've definitely taken out a suite of like 30-ish cards or something, put up 30 cards back, the deck would run better, but I didn't bounce my pips, and now I have 2 made lands that tap for white when I need a lot more red in my deck.
Yeah, like if you're a Mardu deck in the example we use, and you end up taking out accidentally a lot of the white-red cards and adding mostly black cards, it's like, well, now your mana base is going to look way different, and you might need a lot of untapped black on the first few turns. Another example I like to see, that I see all the time, is 5-color decks don't need every single shock land or every single check land or every single triome every single time. It's like, it's easy to just go 10, 10, 10, and then 5 tap lands or whatever, and I'm done. But this, like with 5 colors, they're not all going to be 20% of your deck. You're going to have, in a lot of cases, green is the most prominent color. Half your deck's green. And then you might have like a fall off of like the next 2 colors or 10%. But then red, you only have 3 red spells in your whole deck. So why would you devote an equal share of red and green producing lands when red is such a low percentage?
It's just easier on you to be able to play these spells on time, and Moxfield.com actually is the best way to check this out. It says on the bottom the deck percentage of pips that you have, and it'll tell you how much the lands make too. So if you need to tinker with that, it will really just help you a lot to visualize it.
Yeah, this is actually funny because I was thinking of where could I put the Moxfield ad in this video, and it doesn't matter. I don't even know if we could go this whole video without talking about Moxfield, even if we weren't sponsored by them. So it kind of just doesn't matter where the Moxfield ad. It's baked into the whole thing. But I think the most important feature of Moxfield that really helps you with this tip is seeing the mana base spread of like, I have, 60% of my deck is green, but only 30% of my lands make green. Like, I'm going to have to change that. And it's really easy to see that. Versus if you were playing or building on some redacted website or building in paper, you would never be able to look with your eyes in 2 seconds to figure that out.
BZ knows that when I draft, I actually take out a calculator and crunch numbers for mana, but Moxfield makes it a lot easier, so I can leave my graphing calculator at home.
Yeah, we actually both have examples of this tip in action with our Bant decks. You have a Bant deck with tons of 1-mana mana dorks, which are all green. Your Galadriel deck.
Yes.
And that deck, since it wants untapped green source turn 1 every single game, doesn't really play Glacial Fortress. It might not even need some of the other dual lands like a Deserted Beach, because when are those going to be factored in? Like, you have white pips, but you're not playing a million triple whites. You don't need 3 white mana on turn 2, but you do need green mana turn 1 every game.
It's really true. It just, you have to know your priorities. If you can wait till turn 5 to play a land that taps for white, but you need green and blue instantly, then you're going to be putting your Yavimaya Coasts in there. You're going to be putting your Breeding Pools, and you're going to be leaving your Hallowed Fountains at home.
Yeah, you might play Hallowed Fountain just because it's fetchable, but like for anything that's not fetchable, you probably, like, Hallowed Fountain might be your one blue-white duel, and then you might just leave everything else away. I also have a Bant deck, but it's a little bit different. I'm playing Enchantress, but I still play Wild Growth, Utopia Sprawl, Burgeoning, Exploration, all of these 1-mana green plays. So I'm just leaving Glacial Fortress at home. I just don't need it, even though it looks pretty and it makes everything even. I'm going to play 1 Horizon Canopy extra, where it's like, oh, well, this doesn't look right, and you can't spot the whole cycle in my deck, but it doesn't matter because my deck's going to just play better.
You don't always need every part of the cycle. But if you want to protect your cards in style, may I mention to you our playmats. This is Miso as Displacer Kitten, and he's adorable and my son, and you should definitely pick one of these up on gamermats.com.
That is right. Nitpicking playmats are here, and I want to express just how limited they truly are. This is like a prototype Amber mat of Queen Marchesa, aka Queen Meowchesa, but we love our cats. They're a big part of the channel, and we figured let's make our first ever playmat drop, the cats. So if you want to get these playmats, you only have realistically a couple more days. They are going to be on sale at gamermats.com. We have a link in the description till June 3rd. And then they're gone forever. The only ones that will exist will be the ones that we have in our collection on Whatnot. So those are the only 2 places you can buy them, and one of them is about to dry up. So I just want to let you know, for $35, If you want to buy a playmat, that's a really good quality. Stitched edges.
It's very thick, very heavy. They're like a pound each.
And time is just running out for those. So I just want everybody to get in. Everybody who wants it should be able to get it. Tip number 3 is possibly the most important tip because it's kind of a variety of tips, but it all just kind of correlates to understanding your average mana value of your deck and what that actually means. Now, I will say the best way to find out your average mana value is on Moxfield because you can just scroll right to the bottom and it just tells you very succinctly and you don't have to do any math or anything. So that's what we're going to be referring to if you're wondering, like, how do they know that? We're using Moxfield. It tells you that, like, right on the bottom.
This deck AMV really matters because it's going to tell you both how many lands you need and what turn roughly you can play the bulk of your spells. If you have an average mana value of 2 or 3, you're going to be able to play a good chunk of your spells most of the time. But if it's getting to 4, 5, and 6, that starts getting a little dicey to the point where you might not be able to cast a few spells or a bunch of your spells in the first few turns, which means you might fall behind your other opponents.
I think the only average mana values you could ever see are going to range from 1, which is nuts low, to 4, which is really, really high. I think, maybe we'll extend 5 as the very upper end. If you have an average mana value higher than 5, I think you have a non-functional deck. So mostly what we're going to be talking about is between, let's say, 2 and 5, because everything else is like definitely outliers. CDH decks with average mana value 1.2, that's not real. That's not what we're talking about. We don't play CDH really. So we are going to be talking about, from 2-ish to 5-ish. It's a pretty big range, even though it's only 3 numbers. The higher average mana value decks, I've seen this all the time, you're going to lose games, or you at least have the potential to lose games by struggling to hit your land drops, or just by not playing your spells on time, or by not impacting the board enough. If all of your spells are 5 mana, you're going to have trouble during the first 4 turns hitting all your land drops, affecting the board, removing problematic threats that might come down early, like Soul Ring or like Rhystic Study.
It also makes those turns so much more vital because if you do miss a land drop, then it just completely throws your game off a full extra turn. If you have a lot more 1-mana mana dorks, for instance, and you have 3 lands but you have 4 mana dorks and you're consistently doing that, it'll be a lot more smooth than if you only have 5 drops in your hand, basically.
Yeah, these really, really clunky decks, they it depends on your commander, obviously, but those are the commanders that can be targeted more frequently. We're talking like Kalia, Jalira, Henzi, Giada, decks that you would expect to have really high average mana values, but the commander balances it out a little bit, and then the players who make them have to do a little bit of extra deck building to make sure that their deck full of 8 mana angels can still play the game on turn 4.
You have to make sure that you're keeping that in mind. One of the ways to keep it in mind is you can possibly put more lands in your deck. If you are just going to be drawing the average amount of cards and you need to hit those land drops, put more lands in your deck and you can hit them on time.
That could definitely be one solution. I've seen decks with 38, 39 lands that really need it because they've got such a greedy, mana-hungry deck. More lands in your deck means that each card that is not a land has more weight in the percentage when we calculate average mana value. Like if we took this to the extreme, if you have 99 lands in one spell, if that's a 3-mana spell, your average mana value is 3. Yeah. But if you start going, I've got 98 lands and a 2-drop and a 3-drop, well, now your average mana value is 2.5. They each have more weight the more lands you play.
Another way to help with this is with card draw. If you are drawing more cards, you can hit more land drops or you can get to the spells that cost cheaper, and so you can play on time a little bit more. This can really help if you have a higher average mana value, which a lot of these decks really do need to function properly.
I find that sometimes just having enough card draw in my deck is as good or even better than ramp when it comes to just hitting my land drops. Like if you play Rampant Growth on a turn where you don't have a land to play, you're not actually cheating anything. You're barely scraping by to hit your land drop. But if you can draw some cards and then hit a land drop, it's kind of a better situation because now you have more cards in your hand and you still have a land, and it probably entered untapped, actually.
Whether it's thinning your deck or you're actually just seeing more cards and knowing, like having a little bit more information, it's just so vital in playing the game and playing your stuff on time.
Right. So if I'm seeing an average mana value of 4 or 5 and I'm getting a deck to be audited, I'm looking and I'm going, okay, I'm expecting to see some kind of noticeable change in this deck that is different from other decks. Maybe they have way more ramp, way more card draw. They have a bunch of 1-drops to balance out the fact that they have a bunch of 8-drops. Something's going to have to show up in that deck for me to go, oh, okay, I get it. That's how they're powering out these 8-drops.
I think one of the examples is like with my Selvala deck. There's a lot of 1-drop mana dorks in there. You play Selvala turn 2, and your commander makes mana. So it makes a little bit more sense because you always have that consistent mana production in the command zone. If you have that, you also might have a little bit more leeway when having a higher average mana value.
Curve also factors into that because with that deck, you have a guaranteed turn 1 play, but you also have a guaranteed turn 2 play, which is a 3-drop. So the deck can skimp on some of that early game because you're going to have a Mana Dork and Selvala, and then from there, you're kind of just trying to play 4 and 5 drops like from the get-go.
Yeah, I'm trying to draw as many cards as fast as possible so I can get to the bigger threats and just power out things faster than my opponents, and it makes a little bit more sense there. But if you don't have those early turn plays, it's hard to keep up with the rest of the table who does.
So you definitely have to relate your average mana value to what your first 3 turns of the game will look like. I think those are like pretty critical turns. We're not playing this competitive game where the game ends, but the fact, like, you can do a lot of developing in the first 3 turns, and you can figure out a lot of how the game's going to go for you, what the problems are in that early amount of time, and it's kind of critical. And this is how players kind of lose the game when they disregard the first 3 turns or they keep a really weird hand that doesn't do anything. It's like, well, why did you lose? It's because you missed out on spending a lot of mana in the early turns, and something like if you had mulligan to find a Mana Dork that your deck really needs, you now have a totally different game plan.
Mulligans are just so important in Commander, but that's a topic for another video. Another thing to consider is pips. I feel like our battle box has taught me this more than anything else because even though there are 3 mana cards, if they're all white pips and you have a 5-color deck, that's incredibly tough to cast.
Yeah, this is kind of going to impact what you can put in your deck. I think, generally speaking, mana in EDH is very, very good. And if you have a no budget, it's almost perfect between fetch lands and shock lands and whatever else. But I think you still have to pay attention to it. It's not like you can't just ignore it. But when you look at the pips of your spells and at the lands, I think you're not going to have too much trouble. But some people just don't do that. You know, they have triple blue, triple blue, triple blue, triple blue, and then they have all Llanowar elves in their deck and forests. And it's like, well, how are you going to get there?
Yeah, it's such a bummer when you realize that, I guess. So always take that into account with your lands more so than just like the colors. I count the pips actually when I like do it. I like look at Moxfield, but if I have to do it manually, I just start counting the pips when we do like draft or something, and I'll split them into piles and I'll just like calculate from there more than the average mana value sometimes.
But that's the other thing too, is if you have a 3-drop that's triple white and you know your deck's not that great at making triple white, is it really a 3-drop? Like, are you really going to be able to slam Archmage's Charm every turn on turn 3? It factors into like, maybe your average mana value is actually a little bit higher than it looks like because you're playing Eerie Ultimatum and you're playing some triple, like you're playing Insatiable Avarice and you're trying to pay black, black, black for it. Like, that's stuff to consider. So I would say if your deck has a bunch of like pip intensive stuff and your mana base isn't fantastic, I would look to like see that if your average mana value is whatever, like 3.5, that's probably more like 3.75.
It is rough to cast those spells sometimes, and some spells have a deceiving mana value. For instance, Blasphemous Act or some of the MDFCs. I know you can set in Moxfield, not part of the ad, that they're like 0 or 1, for instance, because you should kind of predict what you're going to be paying for them normally. Blasphemous Act, I'm casting it into a creature-heavy board, so I'm never going to be paying more than 2 or 1 for it in general.
Yeah, really, that's a card that seems like it's 1, 2, or 3 mana tops. Delve cards are also this way. If you're playing a lot of Thought Scours, Gitaxian Probes, Fetch Lands, then you can afford to play Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. But are they 8 mana? No, not really. They're probably like, I would say 3 or 4. Kind of just get a ballpark of what the average is. And you can adjust this by deck on Moxfield so that, you know, one deck's average of Dig Through Time might be different than another deck, so you can keep them separate. But it gives you a better idea because now, even if you just had these 3, even if you just had Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, Blasphemous Act in a Spellslinger deck, Moxfield's going to take that and they're going to go, oh, you're playing 2 8-drops and a 9-drop. No, not really. So just adjust them in the deck, then scroll down to see what your average mana value is. And it's not going to, and you're not going to be worried of like, why is my average mana value 3.7? I thought it was going to be like less than 3. It's like, well, there's probably some stuff you can alter. And we like to put MDFCs as 0 because most of the time we're playing them as a land. So I want them to count as a land that can sometimes be a spell. That's kind of where I have them.
I think another like example of this is what you have in the command zone. For instance, we keep joking about BZ drawing, like making this Honest Rutstein Umori deck, but if you play those like one turn after another, the next creature is going to be 2 less. So all of the like creatures that you have in your deck, you can just kind of knock those down a little bit because you will always have the guaranteed 3 into 4 for 2 reduction.
Some commanders have to completely rework manually their average mana value too. Like the Dragon. If you're playing 35 dragons in your deck, your average mana value is not 4.5. It's almost basically 3.5. If almost all of your dragons, half of your spells are just one less, and they can't not be one less. That's one where you can kind of do some mental math to figure out what your average mana value actually is. You might even have to do real math if you're only playing 20 or something dragons, but it does change it. Henzi is another one. Every time you play Henzi, every creature in your deck gets cheaper.
It really does matter. So it does depend on the deck. Sometimes the average mana value isn't as scary as it might seem. But if you want to check another way to level up your deck building process, why don't you check this video right here?
It's pretty helpful.